Hi there everyone, and welcome to our discussion on Intro to Pathology. Our goal here is to talk about typical cellular activity. That way you're all set for all of the ways that the body is going to have abnormal activities when we're talking about different conditions and pathologies. But first we have to talk about things that you may not have been familiar with from your undergrad prereq type work and make sure that those are set. That way we can have our conversation about different organ systems and different types of tissues and their conditions. Okay, so first off, typical cellular activity. It includes things like cells getting injured, cells adapting to their environment, cells aging, and cells dying. All of these things are included under normal activity. There's a lot of different ways in which they manifest and a lot of different ways in which there can be a pathology influencing how these different events come through. This lecture also acclimatizes you to a lot of the language you're going to be hearing. So that way, if I say something like metaplasia, it's not the first time you've heard it. This is the first time you've heard it. And then as we go into different concepts, it's more familiar. So let's kind of jump in here. Cellular injury. Okay, so cells get injured all the time, it turns out, from just regular life, and there's specific forms of injury. And it behooves us to know the different forms so that we're familiar with how we treat and care for these folks who have experienced pathologies that are causing one of these forms of injury, as well as what is safe. I would say that one of the things you really want to be familiar with is elements of safety when we're talking about this, because we're talking about basic science, right, which is fantastic. And sometimes it's kind of hard to get a sense of how this applies clinically. So as much as possible, be thinking right off the bat, okay, how can this knowledge make me a better provider, right? Well, I'll tell you here right off the bat, one of the most important forms of cellular injury to know as a PT is ischemic injury. We're going to interact with it regularly. So let's start off with it here. At the tissue level, this is when there is not enough blood. It's that simple. You know that blood brings good products to the tissues and the cells and takes away waste products. So without appropriate blood flow, you'll have a buildup of waste and not enough nutrition. So two primary causes of this. One is reduced flow, which happens all the time and is easily the most common source of ischemia. Less common, and one that we'll talk about more when we get to our cardiac discussion, is something called demand ischemia. This is an unusual one, but it's a good expression, I think, of your understanding of physiology, if this can make sense to you. So imagine you are running at full speed, you're running from a bear, you're running for your life. The muscles of your legs, around your ribs and everything are working at maximum levels, and they're having to do this over an extended period of time. And then your body is just dumping cortisol into everything. Your body is basically at maximum energy use. And what can happen is that the energy demand of your body exceeds what the blood is providing. And so what happens is your vitals start to change, trying to alter the physiology to provide enough blood, but it can't keep up. Like the heart isn't in good enough shape, if you will. So this would be somebody who's sedentary all the time and suddenly has to run from a bear. They're going to experience some level of demand ischemia. So this can happen in different situations, but basically under the easiest context is under serious duress. And then one that seems to always, I tell this story every year and y'all seem to really enjoy it. Cocaine actually creates really severe demand ischemia due to altering the physiology of the heart. And when we get to heart abnormal physiology, I'll describe it because it'll actually, for whatever reason, stick better in your head than when I describe someone running. Okay, but most of the time what we have is reduced flow. Now, this gives you two different forms of results. Either there's less oxygen, like not enough, like there's a boundary, right? There's a threshold of a certain minimum you need in order for everything to stay healthy. So that's hypoxia. And then there's anoxia, which is complete lack. There's nothing, okay? So they can happen kind of in variations. You can have hypoxia that builds to anoxia. You can have anoxia that drops down to hypoxia, but that gives you a sense of those two terms. Secondarily, you have ATP synthesis lost. Remember that ATP synthesis needs oxygen in order to run, right? And so without that, you lack aerobic metabolism. And so as soon as you get that, you get alterations in intercellular physiology, you get ionic accumulation, and then actually, if you remember, the membrane of the cell actually requires ATP in order to stay coherent. Without that, you're going to have alterations in kind of the function of the cell membrane at the same time as it's got ionic accumulation, basically too many ions inside. And so what that's going to lead to is an osmotic pressure driving fluid into the cell, and it it gets edemic. So basically, hypoxia or anoxia very, very quickly results in cellular injury. If it stays long enough, then you do have cell death, but initially it's at least just injury, right? So ischemia creates cell damage through primarily this ATP loss. And there's other elements too with the metabolites and things like that, but that's one of the big ones to know. Okay, so this one is the different ways that we end up with ischemia. So we'll come back to them in each tissue or organ system discussion as we go along. So for example, we talk neuro, we talk cardio, we talk pulm, we talk liver, you name it. There's going to be some form of ischemia affecting all of those tissues in some pathology or sort of structural issue. But I gave you all some easy ones to kind of latch onto as you're coming into this conversation with me. So first is obstruction of the respiratory tree. So the easiest way to think of this is there's absolutely no air coming in because something's in the way, and that something can be water. So this is what happens in drowning. There's no way for oxygen to come through. Unfortunately, we are not fish. We don't have that kind of capacity to draw oxygen out of fluid, but this gives you a simple sense of that, or if somebody is choking on something and they're suffocating. So this can happen from like somebody swallowing like a toy or whatever, like a child, or this can be actually too much mucus, right? Okay, next is going to be inadequate O2 transport across respiratory membranes. Something is in the way. So this is actually how severe COVID eventually can be lethal to someone, is that there is a buildup of thick mucus across the lining of the lung, and you can't have oxygen transport. So the blood is making it to the lung just fine, but it's not able to take up what it needs and dump what it needs to get rid of. Then maybe everything's working fine, but oxygen can't transport properly in the blood. So that's inadequate O2 transport. A classic example of this is sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, there's alteration to the form of hemoglobin, a protein that's on a red blood cell that actually carries oxygen. And with the mutation, the hemoglobin is misshapen, the red blood cell is misshapen. And so it basically can't carry as much oxygen as a non-sickle cell type red blood cell. So that's how these folks end up with ischemic events, as well as there's another source of this too, but we'll get to that later when we get to our hematology discussion. Then the cell itself, maybe, all the organs are able to exchange oxygen and CO2 just fine, nothing's in the way, blood is bringing everything in like it's supposed to. However, the cell itself is unable to use the oxygen that's provided. A classic example of this is carbon monoxide poisoning. Something is in the way, blocking it. Blockage of a blood vessel. Honestly, this is probably the most common thing we're going to see. So this happens in the case of a myocardial infarct or a heart attack or a CVA, cardiovascular accident, or a stroke. So those are the two leading causes of mortality in the United States and honestly most of the developed world, and honestly most of the world in general. So basically the blood isn't flowing because something is in the way, and that something is a blood clot. So different ways to get to the same outcome, and different kind of ways that they manifest, and different effects that they have on the body as a whole, because some of these are affecting the whole body immediately, some of them are affecting just a piece of it, and so you kind of have like different elements of how quickly this occurs. You'll see as we go through each organ system. Next are infectious agents. So these are bugs, right? Bacteria, viruses, mycoplasmas, fungi, rickettsia, protozoa, prions. Ugh. Helminths. Prions scare me. Those are freaky. Prions play with our definition of how we define life. Those are freaky. And helminths, which you would think you don't encounter, but actually you do sometimes. Mostly though, it's bacteria and viruses. Honestly, that's mostly what your body's encountering and mostly what we're going to end up talking about. The other stuff maybe once in a while, but not so much. So how do these two primary infectious agents actually injure the cell? Well, mostly by invading. So bacteria invade cells, release toxins, and eventually cause the lysis or rupture of the membrane. And there you go. So what happens when a cell ruptures is that the toxins that were building up inside of that cell, and this is pretend you receive a bacterial infection, your own cells break open, and this infection comes out via toxins. Like that's the manifestation of how it damages nearby things. So what will happen is nearby cells are then damaged in turn, and cellular damage always activates some element of the immune system, which is what's supposed to happen so that you can stop the process of infection. Viruses injure cells by taking over our ability to make DNA inside our own cells, and they hijack the cell's DNA replication to perform viral replication instead. This disrupts normal cellular function, though, because cells are doing things like making proteins to, make neurotransmitters or something. Instead, they get told to make viral DNA or RNA. So then the cell's not taking care of itself, and it basically injures itself, either through the toxins getting made or through not doing its job, and you eventually end up with the cell dying. While the hijacked cell is doing this, in addition, the cell then begins to make foreign proteins, like not your body's own proteins, but the proteins expressed by the virus, and those end up on the outside of the cell. This is actually how the immune system eventually recognizes and destroys that cell. We'll talk more about this in our next conversation on the immune system as a larger idea, but this is how a cell can get injured. Bacteria jump in, or viruses jump in, they release toxins, or they take over and they get the cell to do a job that isn't its job, and at some point the cell is damaged and or ruptures and dies. So we have images here that kind of give us more of a sense of that. So what I have here is an example of the types of injury that occur. You don't need to know anything on this slide. It's me expressing visually the stuff that we had previously on the last slide, if that helps with how these picture slides tend to flow. It's the same information again, sometimes with a little more nuance. If you need to know that nuance, I'll tell you here verbally, or you'll see it written. Otherwise, this is just giving you a visual way to process all the written words that you saw earlier. Okay, so cell injury and death. Let's do this image here. So this has a description of different types of injury that occur with, and kind of like the result from an injurious stimuli. So, and then kind of what happens to create the cell signaling. So this kind of gives you a sense of, like, on a more nuanced cell bio level, what's occurring when you have the release of something such as proteases. So it's just giving you a sense. So all of that biology you did back in maybe high school or undergrad, that's kind of where this is playing out right here. It's this idea of there's a whole bunch of stuff inside of the cell, and when the cell gets damaged and starts releasing things, those things that were inside of the cell were contained in a safe way. A lot of them are enzymes. And you don't want enzymes randomly running around without control. A lot of the body is about control. It's got dangerous stuff buttoned up, and it uses it in a focused way, a coordinated way to protect you. But when that's not coordinated, not focused, you're causing accidental damage to good tissue. This is an important pillar concept we're going to learn more about here in a little bit with the immune system. Next here is the most classic example, I would say, of an infectious agent hijacking and taking over the body systems, HIV. So HIV is its life cycle is a famous way to look at kind of how viruses can injure a cell. Basically, it merges with a regular cell. It's actually a white blood cell. And it comes into the nucleus, it takes over the nucleus of this white blood cell, then instead starts producing HIV RNA, and that eventually comes out and it's released into the body so that it can do it again and again until finally the cell shuts down, breaks open, and releases even more HIV RNA. So this is kind of how we can think of viruses. This is an extreme example in a very, very potent virus, but this is actually what viruses are doing inside your body to certain types of cells. They all have a certain target type of cell. When you get a cold virus, I mean, this is actually what's happening. The virus is taking over different cells in your body and trying to make more of itself, and then, eventually damaging those cells to the point where they do die. Down here, we have an example of how the body recognizes this is happening. So this yellow one here, that's the infected cell, and see these little green things? That's an artist rendition of a protein that's on the outside of all of our cells. And kind of like a fingerprint, all of our fingerprints are unique. We also all have unique self proteins, and all of our cells have those with the exception of red blood cells, interestingly, which is why you can donate them safely. And this white blood cell here, which is the type we're going to learn in the next lecture, basically is constantly sniffing out and making sure that those proteins are the correct type. It's like, oh, so for me, it would be like my Liz protein. My Liz protein's on all of my cells, right? So my white blood cells are constantly like, is that the Liz protein? Is that the Liz protein? They find something that isn't the Liz protein, they destroy it, default. So that's kind of how viruses and bacteria and other foreign substances can get detected. What proteins are being expressed? So an infected cell is going to demonstrate or express abnormal proteins. So that's how infectious agents get caught. Okay, next is going to be immune reactions. So this is unfortunately a self-injuring thing. So sometimes the immune system incorrectly identifies a threat where there is none. It then attacks the host. So there's three forms, which we're going to learn about. One is hypersensitivity. So this is something that isn't actually an issue, such as dust or pollen. It's not actually hurting you, right? But the body through a process we'll learn about, perceives this as a threat and ramps up its immune response. So that's a hypersensitivity reaction. Anaphylaxis is when this happens on a whole body systemic level, and that is significantly dangerous. We're going to learn about that too. Autoimmune is when the body attacks its own tissue, usually a specific type of tissue. And the machinery for that we'll learn about as well. But these are 3 forms. And you can see here different examples. So let's again use that concept we learned earlier, in which we're talking about that expression of different types of proteins on the outside. So right here we have a white blood cell. And again, it's constantly sniffing. So again, for me, it would be sniffing out Liz molecules, right? Basically, the white blood cell incorrectly learns that my Liz molecules are not Liz molecules. It makes a mistake, basically. And it's like, oh, well, let me attack that then. So it makes antibodies for my own self-Liz proteins and attacks that. So it's usually a certain type. Like it's more nuanced than I'm saying, right? Like I'm simplifying it so that it's easy to make sense in just a few minutes. But basically, the body starts attacking itself because it misidentifies its own proteins. So that's an autoimmune disorder. So that's immune-mediated injury. And there can be different forms of this, but a big one here with an allergic response is that the body basically has repeated exposure to something that isn't actually an issue, such as, let's say, a pollen molecule, and it starts building antibodies against this pollen molecule. But over time, this becomes an issue, and you end up, again, with unregulated immune activity. And anytime you have unregulated immune activity, it's just like, oh, there's always pollen. It's pollen season. Oh my gosh, there's always pollen in the nose. Here we go. And it's just always turned on. That's a bad thing. You do not want the immune system turned on all the time, like in work mode. That's going to lead to damage. We're going to talk about what that means here in a little bit. But that gives you kind of a sense of how the immune system can cause injury to different structures of its own body. Okay, genetic factors. This one you'll hear about more as you kind of come into practice. This is getting more and more attention these days with genetic-based approaches to rehabilitation type medicine. So with this one, this is an understanding of how the person's pathology is expressing based on their genetics. So there's 3 types that we tend to see, and one form is an alteration to your actual chromosomes. So this can cause multiple abnormalities of expression. So this would be a larger diagnosis such as Klinefelter syndrome, Huntington's disease, or perhaps Down syndrome. You can also have what's called a point mutation. A single gene causes change, is mutated, and some sort of change occurs in the amount or function of a protein. The classic for these, there's 2, sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. It's one mutation causing a massive problem with a protein, and the way that that expresses throughout the body is the pathology, right? But the etiology, or how it came to be, is a genetic factor which cause cellular injury. And then you can have multiple genetic mutations interacting with how a person lives in the world to create the condition. So for example, we call this being genetically loaded, right? Maybe you're genetically loaded for diabetes, but you never eat in a way that tends to lend diabetes to expressing itself. It's there, it's ready to go. But if you, I don't know, are super low stress, eat a great diet, exercise regularly, sleep well, then it just never expresses. You carry it. You have every potential for diabetes, but it never expresses. So this is a good definition of epigenetics. It's mutations that only reveal themselves with environmental pressures. And that term environmental is getting broader and broader, right? So that can be the food you eat, the stress of your home situation, all sorts of different things, right? But it's basically your lived experience plus your genetics. It takes both to make the condition happen. Okay, let's go ahead and look at it here. This is the same information, but with a different visual format for those of you who like more of a graphic look. So again, chromosome mutation or injury. This is bigger, right? The chromosome has lots and lots of things on it. And so when that mutation expresses, it's going to have a larger effect across multiple systems. Or you can have a mutation altering just one gene, which causes a change in proteins. And so proteins are powerful, of course, so that does still create a systemic issue, but in a different way. So that example there would be like sickle cell anemia, one mutation to hemoglobin and the way it folds, and the way the red blood cell shapes. Mutations plus environment, the classic here is going to be someone who is genetically loaded for, let's say, hypertension, eats a diet that's really high in sugars and processed foods, and unfortunately their social determinants of health are not ideal, and so hypertension manifests, and eventually this leads to a heart attack, right? So that's kind of the sequence there that we look at when we're thinking about genetic factors in disease.